Last time we were talking about two of the four tools the Fed has. Today we're going to talk about the other two. These are pretty simple, so it shouldn't take us too long here. All right, so the third tool the Fed has, right? The first two were, remember, open market operations, right? That's used the most often. And then the second one is the reserve requirement. That's actually used the least often. The reserve requirement's very, very rarely changed. The third is called the discount rate. And the discount rate is, you need to know the definition of this. This is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks for loans. So remember, in the last video, I was giving you that scenario where, like, my bank doesn't have enough reserve, so it goes to another bank and asks them for a loan. Well, maybe my bank's had some bad news lately, and it doesn't sound like my bank's doing very well. And so I go ask another bank for a loan, and that bank says, "Yeah, we're not going to give you a loan because we're afraid you may not pay us back tomorrow." Well, if I keep getting denied by banks, then eventually what I can do is I can go directly to the Federal Reserve Bank. Remember, the Fed is a bank's bank, right? So I can go to the Fed and ask them for a loan. The interest rate that the Fed charges me is called the discount rate. Now, you might ask, why didn't I just go to the Fed in the first place? Why did I ever bother, even asking another bank? When you go to the Fed, that's kind of like a sign that, things aren't going well for your bank. So banks want to avoid that look because it's not a good look for them. It could make their customers worried. It could make other people worried. So it's not a good look for them. Also, they have to put up, collateral, which just means, they have to, say, hey, Fed, if we don't pay you back, you'll get to, repossess our buildings and stuff. And so banks don't really like that, right? They prefer not to do that. But the discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges banks for loans. So remember, Fed funds rate between private banks. Discount rate is between the Fed and private banks, right? But it's just an interest rate, right? So it's the price for a loan. So again, it's that same basic idea that we've been talking about with interest rates before. If the Fed increases the discount rate, that's going to raise interest rates and make it harder to get a loan. And if there's less loans, there's less money. And if they decrease the discount rate, it'll make it easier to get a loan, more loans, more money, okay? So let's put, to do the fourth one, I'm actually going to talk about all four of them together because I've actually already talked about the fourth one, paying interest on reserves that banks deposit the Fed. We talked about that a couple of videos ago. So here's what you have, all right? The Fed can have one of two policies. They can have either what's called expansionary money policy or easy money policy. Either one of the names is fine to say easy money or expansionary policy. Okay, think about what expansionary means, right? Expanding things. So expansionary policy expands the money supply. Okay, and if you create money, if there's more money in circulation, that means that the money is going to have less value. So that creates inflation. So expansionary monetary policy or easy money policy increases the money supply and creates more inflation. Contractionary monetary policy, think about the name, contractionary, right? Contracting. Contractionary monetary policy, or what's called tight money policy, decreases the money supply. And if there's less money out there, that means the money that's out there is going to be more valuable, so it actually decreases inflation. So expansionary money policy creates inflation, increases the money supply. Contractionary decreases the money supply and decreases inflation, right? So if they did expansionary policy, what would they do? Well, remember what that means. The Fed wants, if there's more money, the Fed needs there to be more loans. So the Fed's going to take actions that would increase the number of loans. They would buy bonds on open market operations, okay, and that would lower the Fed funds rate. They would increase the amount of money inside of banks. They would lower the reserve requirement, which would allow banks to lend out more money and not have to hold as much in reserves. They would lower the discount rate, which would lead to lower interest rates as well. And the Fed would pay less interest on reserve deposits at the Fed, right? Remember that a bank, when they hold their reserves, they can deposit those reserves at the Fed, right? Well, the Fed pays those banks an interest rate on those reserves that they deposit at the Fed, just like your bank pays an interest on your savings account, right? So if the Fed lowers the interest rate that they pay on deposits, that's going to discourage banks from depositing money at the Fed, and instead they're just going to loan it out, right? So again, expansionary policy, right? Trying to lower interest rates and increase the number of loans. Contractionary monetary policy, decrease the number of loans and raise interest rates. So in order to raise the money supply, or to decrease the money supply. So the Fed would sell bonds in open market operations, right? They'd sell bonds to banks and private individuals in the hopes that that would take money out of circulation. They would raise the reserve requirement to encourage or to force banks to hold more money and lend out less. They'd raise the discount rate to raise interest rates, and they'd raise the interest they pay on reserve deposits. Why? Because then banks would be more likely to deposit their reserves in the Fed and not lend them out to customers. So make sure that you understand the four things you could do for contractionary and expansionary monetary policy. All right, last thing I want to say about this is understand something. The Fed's control over the money supply is not perfect, okay? Because think about what the Fed needs to have happen. The Fed needs loans to create money, right? Well, what if banks don't want to lend out any money? Okay, well, then the Fed's doing all this stuff. It's not going to matter. It's not going to affect the money supply if the banks don't want to lend out money. Okay, they also, in order for those banks to lend out money, banks need people to deposit their money in the bank. Well, what if people decide not to deposit money in the banks? Okay, that's actually going on right now with this coronavirus stuff. Like a lot of people have like withdrawn a bunch of their money. Like we've experienced like some minor currency drains in the economy because people have gone to their banks and started withdrawing money out of their accounts to hold on to cash in case they need to spend it. I guess in case of like some kind of crazy emergency with this virus stuff. So that means that currency is like deposits are leaving banks right now, right? So that means that the banks have less money to lend out. So the Fed can't control the amount of money that you or me or anyone else decides to hold as cash or decides to deposit in the bank. But the Fed needs people to deposit that money in the bank in order for that money to be available for banks to loan out and create more money. Okay. And then again, like I said, the Fed needs banks to loan out the money itself when it's deposited. So their control isn't precise, right? It's not exact. They have to hope that these two things also happen or don't happen, I guess.